Good morning, students. Today we're going to have a very brief introduction to IB Computer Science topic 4. So let's get started. Firstly, what is an algorithm? The most important part of this chapter. Well, it is a series of unambiguous instructions designed in order to solve a problem or achieve a certain goal within a finite number of steps. Now, we have an algorithm given over here. We say A is equal to 0 and loop while A is less than 10. Now, inside the loop, we have A is equal to A plus 1, which just means add 1 to A, and output A, which just means output A. Well, this is extremely hard to visualize, which is why computer scientists use something called a flowchart. Now, a flowchart is a diagrammatic or visual representation of an algorithm, basically. So let's take this one for example over here. Now we said that A is equal to 0, which is the input, right? Now it takes a decision. It says, is A less than 10? Well, if yes, then add 1 to A and output A. If no, then end the program. Now, what we can do actually is trace the value of A and the output throughout this algorithm, right? And to do that, we're going to make use of something called a trace table. Now, what is a trace table? Well, it is a table that simply traces the values of certain variables in the algorithm, right? So in the 0th iteration, which is basically the first row we see in this table, we see that A is 0 and output is 0 because output is nil, basically, because there is no output yet. Now we go to the first iteration, right? In the first iteration, it says, is A less than 10? Well, A is less than 10 because 0 is less than 10. So we add 1 to A and output A. So 1 and 1 because 0 plus 1 is 1, right? Then we go back to the if statement. Is A less than 10? Is 1 less than 10? Yes, it's still less than 10. And then we add 1 to 1, which becomes 2. And then we output 2, right? So this keeps happening, goes to 3, goes to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and finally 10. Now, while we're at 10, it goes back and says, is 10 less than 10? No, 10 is not less than 10. 10 is equal to 10. So we go to the no branch and we end the algorithm, right? So this is the basics of an algorithm. We'll get into more details in later videos. Now, what is a sub-procedure? Well, a sub-procedure is a decomposition of a larger procedure. It contains a series of commands that perform a given task. Now, let's take this different algorithm again, where A is equal to 0, and we're going to loop while A is less than 10. So the first sub-procedure we see is, if A mod 2 is equal to 0, then A is equal to A plus 1, which means add 1 to A. So what this basically does is it checks if A is a factor of 2 or if A is divisible by 2, right? And if it is, then we're going to add 1 to A. And that's the end of the if statement. Now the second has no if, right? It's just going to happen while it's inside the loop. We're going to add 1 to A regardless of whether it's divisible by 2 or not. So this is sub-procedure 1 and this is sub-procedure 2. Now we're not going to get into the flowchart of this. We're going to talk about flowcharts in a later video in which we're going to discuss more complex flowcharts such as this. Now let's go on to the next thing, iteration. Now iteration is a process of repeating a series of instructions. Now let's say A is equal to 0, loop while A is less than 10. A is equal to A plus 1, output A and loop. Again, the same flowchart as what we've done to understand algorithms. But we're going to look at the trace table now. So now a new column has been added. It's called iteration number or int number, right? On the 0th iteration, there's no output and the value of A is 0 because that's what we set it to be initially. Now on the first iteration, the value of A becomes 1 and 1. Second, it becomes 2 and 2. Third, it becomes 3 and 3, as we observed while discussing algorithms, right? Now by the time we reach the 10th iteration, right, it can't have any more iterations because the value of A is 10 and 10 is not less than 10, it's equal to 10. So we end the algorithm there. Hence there are no more iterations. Now let's go to the last part of this video. Again, this is just an introduction, the very ground basics of this chapter. We're going to understand what input, process and output is, something really important throughout computer science, right? So an input is something that is put into a program such as data or information. Right, a process includes the algorithm and all of its sub-procedures, right? The output is something that is produced by the program. Now let's take the example that we just discussed earlier. So we say that a is equal to 0. Well, a is the input into the program. Now, what is the process, right? The process is loop while a is less than 10. As in, we're going to have a while loop while a is less than 10. And in this while loop, at each iteration, we're going to add 1 to a, which means we're going to increment the value of a by 1, right? And then lastly, as an output, we're going to output the value of a each individual iteration after 1 is incremented by a. So a is incremented by 1, right? So these are the very ground basics of topic 4. We're going to get into more detail later. Thank you so much for listening in. We hope we can see you next time. Goodbye.